In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at Sample 1, Studio One's included sample player or sampler. And I'm using Studio One 2.6, but Sample 1 is going to be the same for whichever version that you're using. And this is going to be part one of a two-part series. In this first video, we're going to cover all of the basic features to get you going. And in the second one, we're going to go a little bit deeper into some of the LFO functions and frequency filter functions that we can use. So I'm going to F6 and access our instruments. At the very top here under Personas, I'm just going to drag in. We don't want an impact, we want sample 1. Okay, sample 1. And we're just going to start from the very top here and work our way down and cover everything. So at the very top left corner, we can choose any instruments we have open. If we had two different sample ones or other instruments, we can choose from those there. We can rename, remove, or show in the mixing console. And then here, if we had another instance of Studio One open, or sample 1, we could then choose that by clicking there. And actually, I'll go ahead and bring a second one in so we can see that there. Now we've got a power. We can deactivate sample 1. We've got bypass. And then here we can access settings for our presets. If we've made some adjustments within sample 1 and we'd like to store that as a preset, we could just choose store, replace the current preset, and so on. If we choose show in browser, then it's going to open up in the browser here. Next, we have right and left arrows where we can navigate through our presets, or we can click this drop-down menu to choose. This auto, basically these are controls for automation, and we'll go over these in more detail in part 2. Now with compare, if we were to load some samples in and tweak some of the settings down below here, save that song, and then come back to it on another day, and then start making some further adjustments, we can then at that point click compare, and it will go back to as the settings were when we first opened up, so we can kind of compare the recent adjustments that we've made. If we have two instances or more of sample 1 open and we've made adjustments to one that we'd like to apply to the other, we can copy that, select the other one, and then paste those settings into the other instance of sample 1. Next, we've got a little gear icon here, and if we click on that, we can toggle open these two windows, which will help us adjust automation and control link, so that we can use, if we have a MIDI controller attached to our computer, we can then assign various knobs or faders to the controls within sample 1. And we'll just briefly take a look at that. So if I would like to control the pitch, for instance, first we would need to load a sample in order to make this active. So I'm going to F9 and drag in a sample here. And we're going to get to that, adding samples. This is one way that you can do it, dragging from the browser. But we can now adjust this tune. So the first step that you want to do is whatever parameter you would like to link to your keyboard controller, you want to go ahead and move it. As you can see, that first window will show you what is active. Now, I'm going to turn a knob on my keyboard controller. You can see that that information is being recognized there. And then all we have to do, K1 is just the name of the first knob on my particular controller, the MPK Mini. Then we click this link. If you're in Studio One 3 or above, then there's going to be an arrow here. It's going to accomplish the same thing as this link. We click that, and now I can just use my controller. And as you can see down below here, I've got control over the pitch. And I'm just going to control click to put that back as it was. And then next to the gear icon here, we have a drop-down menu where we can choose from our attached MIDI devices. So we've just seen that we can import samples into sample 1 by dragging from the browser. We can also use the add button, and I'll just go ahead and select a sample here. Once you select an audio file, you do have these controls where you can audition that sample. We'll go ahead and open it, and as you can see, it has added it to sample 1, and our original sample is there as well. If you would like to replace a sample, then you can select that sample and then drag another one on top of that waveform display. And then as you can see, we have changed to that other sample. But by using the add, we're going to keep adding more samples, and sample 1 can have up to 96 samples according to the manual. One other way that we can bring files in is by dragging an audio event from the arrange view. So if I go ahead and take this, I can bring it over to the sample list, and now we've got a third sample in. If I press 2 and bring up the range tool, I can also select a range from this audio event. I'll press 1 and bring up the selection tool, and then drag that over to the list. Studio One then bounces down this range and then adds it as an additional sample here. And whenever we're working with our samples, making adjustments, you want to be sure that you've got whichever one selected that you want to make those adjustments to, and you can do that by clicking in this sample list area. If we would like to remove a sample, we can just select it and then click the delete button. And I'm going to switch over to this other instance of sample 1 that we have open, because one other thing as far as loading files that I'd like to show you is that if you happen to be a Reason user and you have Rex files, you can navigate to any Rex files that you may have, and we can drag that Rex file in, and sample 1 is going to map those slices contained within the Rex file to your keyboard beginning on C3 or middle C. So if I press middle C, we've got the first slice, so each of the slices within that Rex file are then mapped. You can see if you look at the virtual keyboard here, as I click, it's then showing you where these are mapped to on your keyboard. So just a cool feature that I wanted to mention. And I'm going to come back to our first instance. Also worth mentioning, when we drag a file in, if we drag a file from, say, a folder where we have samples, we can then use the previous and next to navigate and select other audio samples that are contained within that folder. That's just another method of kind of going through and finding an audio file that we may want to use for a track we're working on. After we've loaded our samples into sample 1, the keymap range for added samples is C-2 to G8. And this is represented with this bar here above the virtual keyboard, as well as up here numerically, low C-2 to high G8. And we can adjust this range by clicking and dragging this bar. And so then the sample playback is going to be restricted to wherever we have the low and high set. So if I use my keyboard to trigger, and I'm still directed to that other instance, and actually this is good that this happened. What I just adjusted, we're still hearing audio. That's because we have two other samples, and those I did not adjust. So whenever you're making adjustments to the settings, keep in mind that it's going to be specific to the sample that you're working on. And I'm actually just going to go ahead and delete these other two out for simplicity's sake. Now we're on the sample that I made those adjustments to the key map. Now you can see from this meter here, I am triggering the keys on my keyboard, but we're not getting any audio. That's because we've restricted that key mapping to the low is B2 and the high is D3. And there's a couple other different ways that we can adjust this key map. We can actually click within this box here and manually enter in. We can also select and press a key on our keyboard and then select the high. And then as you can see, it pulled that information from the keys that we were pressing on our MIDI controller and then just inputted those in. And you can see that the bar above has adjusted accordingly. But I'm going to go ahead and move this back out to the original position. Now beyond the key map range, we can also control the playback range of our sample. So as it is, that is our sample in its complete playback. Now if we come to this waveform display view and come to the edge, we get a little hand there, and now we can click and drag and come to the right and click and drag. And in this way, this portion of the waveform is all that's going to be played back. And if we need to make fine adjustments when we're selecting this range, there's a zoom feature here. Now this bar here, what I've kind of figured out is it works best for me if I remember that clicking to the right is the best way to adjust this, because it's a little bit funky. So the further to the left you click, the more it's going to zoom in. So if I click all the way to the left, then we're zoomed in pretty far here. And you know, that's really good if you want to hone in on certain areas. So this is the very beginning of that range that we've selected. So if we're ever having any clicks or pops in our samples, this is good to zoom in this deep. Then we can come in and adjust here to kind of get where there's a bit of silence right there, and hopefully take care of any clicks or pops that sometimes happen when we're working with samples. But at the further I click to the right, the more we're going to zoom out. So as you can see, this is how that works. And I've had a tendency to kind of want to grab this bar and move it to navigate and scroll throughout, but you really want to use this bar over here for that. You can then scroll through your whole sample and see what's going on in that way. And I want to go ahead and zoom all the way back out, so I'll click, and then there we are. One thing to keep in mind when we're bringing in our samples is that the default root note is going to be C3 or middle 3. And basically the root note, if you're new to sampling, and you know most likely are if you're watching this introductory video, the root note is going to play back your sample at its original pitch, and then once you start playing above or below that, it's going to pitch it up. So C3 is the root note. We can set the root note to be whatever we'd like, and we would do that by clicking and holding on this little box that has C3 and then dragging and set our root note to wherever we'd like on the keyboard. And this could be useful along with setting the key mapping to, if we wanted to have a group of samples mapped out across the keyboard here, then I could say bring in 6, 7, 8 other samples, set their range, set their root notes to different positions along the keyboard, and in that way I could say even have a complete drum set within sample 1 just mapped across the keyboard at various positions with their individual root notes set where they need to be, where they work best for me. Another quick way of setting the root note is we can come in and type it in, But as we did with the low and high settings, we could just press a key on our keyboard. I'm going to press middle C or C3 on my keyboard controller, and now we're back to that default root note position. And then I'm going to go ahead and expand that key map range back out. While we're in this waveform display window, there's another function I want to touch on here, and that's the loop feature. And actually, I'm going to delete that sample out. It's a bit short. I want to bring in something longer. I'll bring this in here. Now this new sample that we have, the beginning is a bit quiet there, so I'm going to come out. Actually, this looks pretty loud here. Now, with the loop feature, the loop is off by default, but I'm going to click and zoom in a bit here. If we click on no loop, I'll just come to sustain here. You can choose between sustain and release. You'll notice that we now have a little blue bar above the selected range of our sample. So I'll click on sustain and come back to no loop. You can see that that goes away. Click on sustain, and now we have this bar. This allows us to set a range that's going to be repeated over and over. So if I maybe drag this in to maybe this portion here. Now when I trigger this sample with a key on the keyboard, it's going to play straight through. Then once it gets to this bar, it's going to keep cycling back as long as I hold the key down. So let's listen to that. Okay, and so that's what setting up the loop is. And I'll shorten that a bit and maybe even just make it this portion here. Okay, and so that is the loop function, but I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. And moving on to the next function, we have monophonic. By default, this is off, and sample one can play up to 32 voices. After that point, it's going to start dropping notes. So, but if you only want it to play one note at a time, no matter how many keys you're pressing, then you can go ahead and activate monophonic, and then you'll be in a mode where only one voice is going to be heard at a time. And this then brings into the glide feature. If we turn on the glide feature, then we're going to kind of get a rounded effect when we're changing notes, almost like a portamento. So if I let's shorten this sample and make it so that it's hopefully one note here. Actually, I want something longer. Now, if I turn on the glide and change keys, we're going to, set this glide time here. We can use the knob there or click and manually input a value. But now you see, now that we've got the glide on, if I play one note, you hear that bend in there. And that almost adds a bit more realism to this particular sample. And so if we can turn that up, and it will be an even more dramatic effect. Okay. And so that's what the glide feature is. Now the PB range, this adjusts in semitones your pitch bend wheel on your MIDI controller. So in this way we can, I'm going to turn the glide off actually, and control click that to turn it back as it was. So we're working with semitones. Now by default it's on 2, and if I were to trigger our sample and use the pitch bend wheel on my MIDI controller, okay, so that's at 2 semitones. If I change this all the way to 10, see, there's much more of a dramatic effect because the change that were allowed on our pitch bend controller, on our MIDI controller, has been increased. And so that's what this pitch range is. Pitch bend. Did I just say pitch bitch? Pitch bend range. Okay, 2. Edit all. Now this, if we select this, if we have multiple samples in here, and we would like to create the same changes on all of them, then we would want to choose this edit all. So let's get a different sample in here. It can get a little trying to hear the same thing over and over, unless you're working on a track. Okay, so we've got 2 different. So the second one's a little bit quiet. And this could be a good example. I'm going to, the first one is our guitar, the second one is this kind of thumb piano. I'm going to turn the gain up. And this is then just going to affect this thumb piano. So if we're working with samples and we want to kind of get that balance just right between the levels, with edit all off, then the adjustments we make down here are only going to affect that one particular sample. Let's zoom out. And say we want to adjust the pitch. And then I can come here and take this pitch up. Okay, and so you can see that how this is working, and that only one sample at a time is being affected. I'm going to take the tune back to their original position, take that, turn the edit all on, and then now they are both being affected by adjustments we make. And I'm going to control click to take that back, turn the edit all off, and that's basically how that works. Now finally we've reached the bottom, and we've already touched on some of these controls here, but this has already gone on long for this video. I'm going to go into more depth with these functions in part 2, but briefly we've already saw what tune does, and I'm sure that's obvious to most of you. We've got ADSR for these controls. They can each be activated and deactivated by clicking these LEDs up above. Now with the filter, we can adjust filter cutoff for our samples. I'm going to take the guitar out and I'm going to select a range here. So we can adjust the filter here. And depending on the type that you have selected, it's going to affect it differently. We can choose between low pass, band pass, high pass, and have different slopes available to us. So if I do high pass, okay, and we have other different controls there that we can adjust. The amp is going to affect the volume for our sample. We got pan, and I'm going to control click to take that back as it was. And then we have LFO. Now with this briefly, we can kind of control the rate here with this wheel, and as you can see, it corresponds to what shows up in this box. Now if I say want to modulate the pitch with this LFO, then I can turn this dial here for LFO, and it's going to adjust it based on what we have the beats set to. And the type here will adjust the type of oscillation, I guess you could say. I'm not sure if that's right, but you know, this is, if I come to this sign, and it's going to be more rounded, the effect that oscillation is having on the pitch. If I come to the square, then it should be a bit sharper and more cut, like on and off, which should show up more as we come up in the beats. Okay, and so again, I'll go into more depth with how to use these in part 2, and I think that we are going to stop right here. The very last thing I'd like to say in part 1 is that when you're adjusting these parameters, you can click and hold and drag, but if you ever want to make finer adjustments, then you can just use your mouse wheel to control that, you know, in a more fine way. You can also hold down shift and click and drag. And this notification window is going to drive me crazy, but hold down shift and drag, and it's going to be an even finer adjustment. Just wanted to give that little tip there. So hope you got some useful information out of this, and hope to see you in part 2.